It was the saviour MacBook. It finally got rid of that terrible keyboard. It was designed with pros like me and you in mind. But it looked identical to previous MacBook Pros. It was heavier, bigger, thicker, more expensive. Was it worth it? And more importantly, should you buy the 16-inch MacBook Pro now that Apple Silicon-powered Macs are on the way? Welcome back to Ellis Reviews. Thank you for tuning in, and if you've subscribed already, thank you very much. If you haven't subscribed, just hit subscribe and you'll never miss an episode. Now, I've spent just under a year with the 16-inch MacBook Pro. Before that, I had the 13-inch Escape key version, the only one they did with an Escape key and no touch bar. I had that for about 4 years. This was a big investment for me. It was a lot of money. I needed it because of my workload was increasing, and the type of work I was doing was getting much more complicated in terms of video and audio production. In this video, I'm going to give you my long-term-ish thoughts on the 16-inch MacBook Pro. And I'll also reveal how the keyboard has fared, because I'm sure you want to know about that. Let's dig into it. I think before we get into my thoughts on the MacBook Pro 16-inch, I should probably give you an idea of what I do with it, because I think your mileage may vary, and obviously there are lots of different uses for MacBooks, as we all know. So the work I do, I'm a content marketer. I produce content, and that content is written content, it's audio content, it's video, and I need a machine that can do all that stuff and help me run my business day to day. So for example, I use Final Cut Pro almost daily now, and I use Logic Pro for audio. I do a lot of writing. I use an application called Ulysses for that. I do a lot of email marketing, an awful lot of video calling with clients and the partners that I work with. Yeah, I need a laptop basically that can do all that stuff and not break a sweat. Previously, I had the 13-inch Escape Key MacBook Pro, base level specs, 8 gig of RAM. Yeah, it wasn't anything special at all, and I rinsed that machine. I really put it to task for 4 years. But it got to the stage where, like any growing business, it just wasn't doing the task. It was taking longer to get things done than it was to get things done. Now, I've also got a 27-inch iMac, which I think is a 2018 version, I think. That is still a great workhorse, great machine. But this laptop, this 16-inch MacBook Pro, has pretty much all but replaced that machine, really. I use this day in, day out. It's the machine I go to. So, the specs. Now, I will need to refer to these because I couldn't remember, if I'm honest. So, I went for the 2.3 gigahertz 8-core i9, which is like the top level CPU, although not the fastest one. I think it's probably the base level 8-core. It's one of the fastest ones, basically. 32 gigabytes of RAM. I upgraded the graphics card to the Radeon Pro 5500M. You love these names, don't you? I also went for the 1 terabyte SSD hard drive. Went for Apple Care as well, because I think you should really, if it's a work machine, you rely on it that much. That all set me back the princely sum of £3,648. I've never spent that much money on a laptop. In fact, I've never spent that much money on a computer before. I think before that, I'd spent about £2,500 on the iMac, and to me, that was a big investment. So this was a big expense for me, but I knew I'd get a lot of use out of it. So let's dig into what I think. We'll start with the keyboard. Now, unless you've been sitting under a rock for the last few years, you'll be aware that the last generation MacBook Pro had a dreadful keyboard. Now, a little caveat here, I had my previous MacBook with that keyboard for, like I say, about 4 years, I think, in total. And I knew it wasn't a great keyboard, but I didn't know how bad it was until I got this laptop. If you've never used the old generation, and in fact you still get it on a lot of the current MacBooks, but if you've never used it before, it has a very small key travel, which means it doesn't really feel like it's going down when you press it. The two problems with that, multiple problems, but the key problems with that are it's very noisy. That bothered me more than the other issues really, but yeah, very noisy. It's not particularly nice, it doesn't feel very nice. And thirdly, it's prone to lots of problems. Mine I had replaced once, and I think, to be honest, by the time I'd finished with it, it was probably due another replacement because things get lodged underneath the keys, and because of that mechanism, it just doesn't deal with crumbs and everyday life very well. Apple fared terribly out of this. I think it was widely regarded that it was an awful design decision. It was all designed to make the laptop thinner. It was just a stupid idea looking back. However, I stuck with it for 4 years. I did shed loads of work on it. So in some ways it did the job actually, but it wasn't a pleasurable typing experience. Testing them side by side is night and day. The MacBook Pro 16-inch keyboard is fantastic. It's got lots of it's got an acceptable level of key travel. It sounds quite nice as a keyboard can sound. And touch wood, Nearly 12 months in, I've not had a single issue with it. It's been fine. You can probably see in the B-roll of this video that the keys are shiny. That's already, and that's how much I use this. I do an awful lot of typing on it. So keyboard, thumbs up so far, Apple. Let's see how it goes. We'll give it another 2 or 3 years and see where we think then. But I think they've fixed the keyboard issue. So if you're still worried about that, don't. It's a fantastic keyboard. Now, performance. I'm not the sort of guy who's going to sit here and do benchmarks. Basically because I don't care. I find them dull as dishwater. If you want to see benchmarks, there's loads and loads of videos and reviews out there that will give you the information you need. If that stuff's important to you, I appreciate it is for some people. For me, I just know when a computer is quick enough. And my old 13-inch was, like I say, it was struggling towards the end. I was putting it through a lot. It would regularly crash and I'd have to wait for things to render and it would just take forever. Now, the specs that I went with, like I say, they're pretty hefty, 8-core, 32 gig of RAM, top-end graphics card. This thing is effortless, and I don't use it lightly. I do a lot of video editing, often in 4K. This isn't in 4K, oddly enough, but yeah, more often than not, it's in 4K. Also, I do a lot of music production on it as well. I use some really heavy plugins. It just doesn't break a sweat. It's never crashed, apart from odd little crashes you get as part of macOS. It's just blisteringly fast. I only have this model. I've only ever used this model, so I can't compare it against the base spec. Although from what I hear and from what I read in reviews, they're all very capable machines. But I think if you're going to buy a 16-inch MacBook Pro, you're probably someone like me who needs a bit of power and also wants to know that power is going to last for a few years. So it's worth speccing it up as much as you can afford, get enough RAM, get that top-end 8-core processor. I think it's worth doing that. And if you do a lot of video work, get the most expensive graphics card, partly because it's not a huge cost increase. I can't remember the exact amount. I think it was about an extra £100 or something. It wasn't much, but it is just effortless. And I know this is going to work for me for the next 3 or 4 years. There's no question about that. The only thing I have noticed is that it's quite fan happy. And by that, I mean, the fans will come on quite regularly. And I've experienced this. I normally experience it in Final Cut when it's doing rendering, no matter how complicated or uncomplicated the rendering is. But it also, fans will run pretty consistently in Logic Pro if I'm using multiple plugins. And in fact, I'm not often doing that much. If I open, for example, Massive, which is a software synth, it's quite a complex one, admittedly, but pretty much straight away the fans kick in. Now, the performance doesn't degrade at all. It just runs, you don't notice it, but if you take your headphones off, it sounds like an aircraft taking off. And it gets incredibly hot as well. Now, whether or not that is an issue with my MacBook, I don't know. I don't think it is. Because although they have redesigned the chassis to better dissipate heat, that was another problem with the previous generation. I do wonder, in fact, I'm suspicious about the fact that it is probably using those fans just to keep things as cool as possible. I don't know. Just something to bear in mind, particularly if you like a not red hot laptop and one that isn't constantly fanning all the time. It's not a big deal, and it doesn't do it in general day-to-day use, but it's just when you're pushing it a bit, the fans do go, if that might bother you. So yeah, in summary, performance-wise, spec it up if you're going to go with one. I would say if you're a hobbyist content creator, or perhaps you don't do quite as much of that kind of stuff for your work, the 16-inch MacBook Pro is overkill. You'll never use its performance. To be fair, I barely touch it. I think unless you're editing 8K video, multiple streams, and doing, running an orchestra through it, 128 tracks of audio and soft synths, you're not going to push it much. So again, yeah, I'd bear that in mind if you're going to go for this. Now, the design, basically, this MacBook looks like every other MacBook that's been out for the last 5 or 6 years. It's the unibody design. It looks, at first glance, it just looks like the 15-inch MacBook Pro. There's very little to distinguish the two, really. The screen looks slightly different. The screen is slightly bigger, obviously, by an inch, but it feels, having used a 15-inch, this just feels like a 15-inch, if I'm honest. But having said that, I've always been a fan of this design. I think regardless of the old keyboard problems, I think it's an incredibly durable laptop. In a year, nothing really, it gets chucked around a bit in terms of chucked in the bag. I'm very careful, but I've noticed there's a little chunk taken out there, tiny little bit. But apart from that, this unibody design really does hold up well to day-to-day use. That said, it's not a big redesign. I think when I waited for this to come out before I bought it. There was all the rumours about the 16-inch MacBook Pro, and there were some wild rumours as well about it having, you know, Face ID and lots of other stuff that we could get excited about. You know, new design and all sorts of things. It isn't. It's typical Apple, really. They've just released pretty much the same hardware, spec'd it up and redesigned some of the internals. When you compare it against some of the new Windows laptops and even some of the Chromebooks, the design is getting towards the end of its life, I think. The bezels around the screen are pretty big still. I do think it should have Face ID now, personally. I'm not bothered about the thickness or the thinness, whichever way you look at it. I mean, it's slightly thicker than the 15-inch, but not to any great extent. But yeah, this design feels like it's getting towards the end of its life. And I think probably within the next 12-18 months we're going to see a redesign. But I'm a big fan of it regardless. It's very robust. I think for spending over £3,500 on a laptop, you want something that feels substantial. And it really does. It does feel like a tank. However, caveat, it's big. It's really big. I'm used to it now, but it's almost as big as the frame there, as you can see. It's a big laptop. And again, the 15-inch was a big laptop. Absolutely, but I didn't have that personally. I used one occasionally, but I didn't have to carry it around. And you do notice the weight of this thing. I do a lot of cycling, so I cycle into the gym, and more often than not, I won't take it. I'll take my iPad Pro instead. And that's a shame, because I love doing video editing on the go. But I just know that if I need to do that, I need to take a bigger bag, and it's going to be heavier. So it's portable, obviously. It's a great portable studio. I mean, don't get me wrong, being able to take that much power in a backpack is fantastic, but it's a big laptop, and if you're not a big fan of big laptops, it might be too big for you. I'd perhaps wait until we see some bigger improvements to the 13-inch range. But aside from that, yeah, design's great. I wanted to just quickly note the speakers and the mic in this laptop, because it was a big thing when it first came out. Two of the big improvements Apple made was in the performance of the speakers, and also the performance of the onboard built-in mic. Now, don't get me wrong, these are very, very impressive. For laptop speakers, they're pretty good. I think if you haven't heard them, and if you read and listened and watched the other reviews when it first came out, you'd be forgiven for thinking they're like, they could replace your hi-fi. So the way people were talking about them was that like it was some kind of, you know, concert system, PA system. It ain't. They're still laptop speakers, and they're not going to replace anything. They're handy to just blast away occasionally if it's the only thing you've got to play music on. But I never use it, for example, to properly edit audio or produce music, or, if I'm honest, to kind of proof and check the end result with videos, because I just don't trust those speakers as much, and they sound good, but they do not beat a pair of studio monitors or a really good pair of headphones. So speakers are good, but don't expect to be absolutely wowed by them. Same thing with the mic. Now, I've used the mic a lot for video calling, but I've also tested it for just recording certain things into Logic Pro, and it's not bad, but there was a lot of talk about it being studio quality, and that's such an odd thing to say, because studio quality mics, if you know that kind of stuff, are expensive, and they are built for that task, and you just can't fit that kind of technology into a little laptop like that. So again, I wouldn't expect to be able to do lots of studio-like things with it, but it is good for getting ideas down. I'll give it that. You know, I've done some voiceover work on the MacBook Pro, but the crucial thing is I've not used it in the end edit. I've always replaced it with a proper recording. So yeah, I wouldn't get too excited about the mics and speakers. They're great. The mic, sorry, and speakers. They are good, but they're not going to sell this laptop for you. You know, that's not the main reason you should buy this. The screen, I can be pretty quick with this. I think if you've ever used a MacBook screen, you'll know they are wonderful. Great contrast. Really, really impressed with it. It's great for video editing, for photo editing. It also doesn't have any or too many backlighting issues. I've always had a bit of an issue with Apple, with iMacs and other MacBooks, where the backlighting on the LCD has been quite inconsistent. That's just part of that. That's just a trade-off of that technology. It's a bit of a lottery how good yours will be. But this is probably the best screen I've had in terms of backlight consistency. As I say, the contrast is great. It's nice and bright. You can use it in pretty bright environments with no trouble at all. Yeah, expect Apple screen greatness. Now I thought for the rest of this review, I'll just kind of summarise my key learnings with it. So for starters, I think this laptop has a very defined audience. It's pros like me, and professional is a very subjective term. If you consider yourself to be a professional, you are. That's entirely your definition. However, this laptop delivers acres of power, and I'm not kind of over-exaggerating that. It's an incredibly powerful machine. As I say, I'm not going to do benchmarks. You can go and check them out, but it's just very, very quick. Also, it's very expensive. That performance comes at a cost. And also you do pay the Apple tax, let's be honest. You know, I'm sure, again, I'm not a Windows man. I'm sure there's people watching this video who could spec up a a Windows-based laptop for half or a third of the price and it'd be more powerful. I'm sure that's the case. But for some people like me, I'm not an Apple fanboy at all. I just like using Mac OS. I'm in that world. I think as any professional will tell you, once you get into a mindset and into a routine with a piece of technology, you stick with it, because going to something else takes an awful lot of time. So for me, I'm with Mac OS. I do some fairly heavy duty work. I want a machine that lasts a long time. This was a solid investment, but I'm a very specific audience. I think most people will get away with the 13-inch. It's also a great writing device, as most laptops are. The only thing I'd say with that is that I do, as I mentioned earlier, I do turn to my iPad Pro more, simply because it's portable. It's a much smaller device. And if I'm honest, the keyboard's great on that. I almost prefer that as a writing device. The MacBook Pro 16-inch just feels like a bit of a cumbersome writing device, regardless of how great that keyboard is, because it is a really good keyboard. This is also my first experience of the touch bar. At first it was a bit of a novelty, but I'll be honest, I hardly use it. I was trying to think when I was writing the notes for this review what I use it for, and I think I only use it for one or two functions, mainly in Ulysses, which is the writing app that I use. That's it. If it wasn't there, I wouldn't miss it. And more often than not, I'll hit it by mistake. I trigger Siri by mistake multiple times throughout the day. Occasionally it will do things and you think, oh, that's quite handy. But then I think, well, if I didn't know it was there, I wouldn't miss it. And it just feels like a shoehorned piece of technology, which I will not be surprised if we don't see the touch bar in future Macs. Again, you don't have to buy this device to get the touch bar, and a lot of people have argued they'd rather have it without the touch bar. I kind of get that. However, it does have an escape key, which is great. It also has the inverted arrow keys, which everyone wanted apparently. Again, that didn't bother me on the previous model. But yeah, the touch bar, I hardly use it. Battery performance is pretty good. Now, I've not done any tests with this at all. I'm the sort of person, as you will learn if you subscribe to this channel, who would much rather talk about real world usage. I think stats and tests and all this sort of stuff are interesting, and certainly I understand that people find those interesting. I just don't personally. What I find interesting is how I feel about the device in terms of battery life, and the best way to describe it is that normally it's plugged in. I keep it plugged in for most of the day if I'm working in the office. However, if I know that I've got to go out for most of the day, perhaps half a day or something like that, I'll take it out without the charger. As long as it's got 100% battery in there, I'll take it out without worrying too much. Given its performance, and obviously battery life on a MacBook like this depends very, very much so on what you're doing on that device. But in terms of general use, maybe a tiny little bit of video editing, email, web browsing, writing, it gets me through, I'd guess, at half a day probably, constant use. Maybe a bit longer actually, in fairness, but my point being, a real world test and opinion on this is that I don't really worry about the battery life. It's acceptable to me. Given the power that it has, it's acceptable. It's never left me stranded, because I treat it in that way. I know I can't expect miracles from it. It's a big laptop. The batteries in it are fairly big, but I'm appreciative of what it does and how powerful it is. So I kind of manage my usage and my expectation with that. So I wouldn't worry about the battery. It's good. It performs really well. Now, I came from the 13-inch that only had two USB-C ports. This obviously has 4, or Thunderbolt, whatever they are these days. Honestly, if you only have 2 at the moment on one side of the laptop, the ability to just plug your power or anything into either side is more of a godsend than you might think. So yeah, that has always impressed me since I've had it. It's just been a nice little thing, and not to worry. There's no worry about running out of ports either. So that's really comforting. I went for the 1 TB option. If you're a video editor or you work with large files, I'd recommend that as a base really. I think in future I'll probably go for the 2 TB just to give myself a bit more headroom. But what it's meant is that I can just edit on the device, which is a bit quicker anyway, rather than relying on external storage. I never really worry about running out of space. It's nice. You know, in my old MacBook I had 256 gig, which is pointless really. I had to rely on external storage all the time. So 1 TB. If you're kind of umming what to go for, I'd start there. If you can afford more, go for it. 1 TB is actually a really nice base level, I think. So the verdict: should you buy a 16-inch MacBook Pro now? Now the reason that is such a big question on a lot of people's minds is because there are Apple silicon powered Macs on the way. So Apple is now in the process of eventually ditching Intel. Whether or not they'll do that completely is open for debate, but they are going to move away from Intel and put their own chips into these, which makes total sense. I've got no problem with that as long as it's all done properly and all my stuff works. I couldn't care less what's powering it, if I'm totally honest. Now, it does put a question mark over whether it's worth buying a 16-inch MacBook Pro now. This is by far the most powerful MacBook you can buy at the moment. So if you're after a lot of power, my advice is pretty simple. I would buy one. I would not wait around for Apple Silicon. I waited and waited for this. I very nearly bought the 15-inch MacBook Pro before this, and then it came out at the right time and I went for it. Basically, if I had just carried on waiting around for this thing, I would have just got the 15-inch because it would have done the job. So I really would not let Apple Silicon cloud your decision about buying this. I'm going to keep this, as I've said several times, for 3 or 4 years. If I keep it for 4 years, that represents an investment of £900 every year. And the productivity gains I get back from this thing, because of how quick it is and how capable it is, eclipse that £900, well, a huge amount. Trust me, it's a massive return on investment for my business. So I'm not going to buy an Apple Silicon Mac. I'll try one out. I will certainly review one for this channel, but it wouldn't influence me buying this now. If I had to buy one of these now, I'd still buy it. I'm shooting this in September 2020, and the rumours are there's going to be some kind of Apple Silicon powered Mac at the end of this year. If that's the case, that might be great for you. I would just hold on unless you need this power. If you need this power, go for it. If you don't need this power, hold on. I just wanted to say a quick thank you to everyone who has either watched, subscribed, commented, liked, even disliked, anyone who's engaged with my channel over the last 5 or 6 weeks. I started this channel a couple of months ago with 0 subscribers. I now, at current count, I think I've got about 92. It means the world. The fact that you've all kind of bothered to give me your time means a lot. Yeah, thank you so much. There's so much on the way for this channel. I cannot wait. All this stuff is just the start. There's an awful lot coming. As you can see, my studio is starting to take shape now as well. But I am genuinely appreciative if you have engaged with this channel in any way. And remember, just subscribe, you won't miss an episode in the future. It doesn't cost you anything, which is even better. If you're interested in how YouTube works, I thought you might be interested to see the video that kicked off the growth, really. I did a review of the Sony XM4 over-the-ear noise cancelling headphones, and I just did it at the right time. Basically, they were just released at that point. I did a comparison video between the old version, and it just went for it. I mean, it blew up. In my terms, it blew up big time. Not in MKBHD terms or Jonathan Morrison terms, but for me, it really blew up, and it's what sparked the growth I've seen in the last few weeks. So yeah, just keep watching for a link to that video. And again, thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.